Girish Menon has a wealth of nonprofit leadership wisdom that we tapped into during our conversation. He's led global development work as either an executive director or senior leader for over 2 decades, working at STIR Education, ActionAid, WaterAid, and Plan International, all major league NGOs. What really came through with Girish is his compassion, his deep experience, and his enviable ability to articulate the joys and the challenges of his development work. And now I give you Girish Menon. Welcome. It's good to see you again.
Good to see you too, Chip.
After our last meeting, I looked again at your LinkedIn history, and I didn't realize that in addition to STIR Education and ActionAid and WaterAid, you were also at Plan International. So we have that in common.
That's wonderful. Yeah, that's part of the legacy, isn't it, Chip?
You have a much longer and more illustrious legacy than I do, but it's interesting that we were both at Plan International. Well, I'm delighted to have you. I thought it'd be good to get started today by just asking you have such a long career working in education, working in international development, social justice. What's been the driving force for you personally to engage in this work over the years?
When I go back to my childhood, I grew up in a neighborhood which was a very modest kind of a neighborhood in the western Indian city of Ahmedabad in the state of Gujarat. And every day in the morning when I was to go to school, I had to pass by a fairly large and well-established slum area. These are informal settlements of people who live in very poor conditions. They're largely daily wage laborers, have very little to eat, to live. And I think subconsciously that image was it embedded in my mind. And then I'm transported to this really nice school, one of the best in the city, run by Spanish Jesuit priests. And I think there was a spirit of giving that they engendered in you. So there were a lot of these volunteering activities where I used to do fundraising for flood-affected victims, or when we had the war in 1971 in India against Pakistan, that also there was a lot of refugee crisis that was happening in parts of India. So somewhere it stayed with me. And eventually, when I finished my degree and then enrolled to my master's in rural management, that's when I got a much deeper insight into rural India. That was not my choice. I actually wanted to be a marketing professional. I wanted to do a proper MBA, but destiny had other plans for me. I enrolled myself for this course called it was in an institute called the Institute of Rural Management in a town called Anand. That gave me a deep insight into rural India, the challenges of rural India. That was then the pivot in my life to then spend now nearly 4 decades in the not-for-profit sector.
As I said, you've spent a lot more time than I have. But I think a lot of nonprofit leaders have that sort of experience. Two parts of that experience. The part of witnessing something that changed your perspective about your own life and the life of others on the planet. And then the other thing is having an intended career and having that hijacked.
There was a subconscious hijacking that was happening.
A lot of the nonprofit leaders I've talked to have some kind of background experience in marketing, which I think is interesting. I'm not sure what the common thread is there. But anyway, and for me, I'd only been to the U.S. and Europe, had never been into a poor area. And when I was I think it was when I was 15 years old and living in Germany, we took a trip to Morocco. And I had never seen that kind of poverty before. It was more fascinating to me than it was depressing. I think I was intrigued by it. That could be a common experience, I'm not sure. So why don't you give us a short history of your career path? And I know most recently you've been the CEO at STIR Education, but I think it would be helpful to hear what leadership positions that you've had in other organizations as well.
40 years of my career. The first half was spent in India working at the community level with a local organization called the Aga Khan Rural Support Program. And that's where I really got a real grounding or the actual experience of working at the community level, working to raise incomes of people living in poverty in a very eco-fragile area where they had constant droughts and very poor agriculture, very poor access to markets. So that was 3 years out there. And then I followed it up with 4 years in the southern Indian state of Tamil Nadu, where again working with an organization called Reaching the Unreached. I was actually employed by ActionAid and seconded to Reaching the Unreached because it was a partner organization. And there it was run again by a I have this history of working with Jesuit priests or Catholic priests. And in this case, it was a De La Salle brother Kimpton who I was working with, was a British missionary who had set up this amazing organization. And he used to say that I got all programs from the womb to the tomb. And that was literally his approach because right from pregnant women and very young kids to working with the very old and elderly and disabled people, he had a whole range of programs. And that was my first leadership experience where I was supporting him to grow the organization, establish it as a properly professionally run organization so that it could build on its future sustainability. But again, with a very strong element of compassion, which I think somebody like me, who was a city boy and who saw myself as a professional, lacked. And I give full credit to Brother Kimpton to instill that sense of compassion in me to look at the more human side of things. So that was another amazing time there. And then I spent the rest of the time, another 4 years or so, with ActionAid, working in different parts. I had this amazing experience of setting up ActionAid's new programs in the central Indian state of Madhya Pradesh, which had a very vast population of people who are underprivileged and disadvantaged, living in far off remote areas, in hills, in forests, and trying to work with them on longer term development programs. And then a 4 year stint with Plan International in Bangalore in South India, where I was responsible for supporting three large partners. And that's where I got, and this might resonate with you, Chet, because it's your experience with the plan as well, the whole orientation to child rights and what child development means and why child rights is so central to development of communities and working on education and health and child participation. So that was an amazing 4 years as well with Plan in India. I finished off my work in India with the Department for International Development of the UK government as a social development advisor. So that was the first half of my career. And then I moved to the UK with WaterAid, where I was the director for international programs for 10 years. And that was super amazing because it was working across 22 countries in Asia and sub-Saharan Africa, working on water and sanitation and hygiene programs, setting up some new country programs in some parts of sub-Saharan Africa. A great experience. Went on to become the CEO of ActionAid UK, which was the largest member of the ActionAid global family, which spreads across 40 countries. And now, for almost 3.5 years, have been with this super amazing organization called STIR Education. STIR is an acronym for Schools and Teachers Innovating for Results. Its focus is improving motivation of teachers in government schools so that children can be better learners. And as a small organization, punching way above its weight and reaching like 12 million children across India, Uganda, Indonesia, and Ethiopia. So yeah, I've been truly fortunate to work with some amazing organizations and some brilliant colleagues.
That's fantastic. What a list. I spent a lot of time in Ethiopia and Indonesia as well. You said something very interesting. And I think a lot of people assume that people who end up leading nonprofits are saints or they have a saintly predisposition. And I can say unequivocally that I have never been a saint and have never had a saintly disposition. But I think what you said about compassion is very interesting because I think this work can awaken compassion in some people. There's certainly a kernel there for most people who do this work. But it's interesting to hear your description because I think that's also true for a lot of nonprofit leaders.
Absolutely. I think there has been a trend over the last several decades to have a more professional cadre of people. And the compassion, which was possibly the driving force up until, let's say, the 1970s or even the 1980s, seemed to be disappearing. But I'm
Hmm.
glad that corporates are coming back with compassion. Very recently, I attended a training which was hosted by Unilever on compassionate
Hmm.
leadership. And I think businesses are now increasingly thinking of compassion, just as nonprofits have been increasingly thinking of having more business principles embedded in their operations towards to drive more efficiency and effectiveness.
One could argue that both ways. What seems like a world that's becoming increasingly coarse and insensitive, I have a strong bias toward mindfulness since I've been teaching meditation and mindfulness for a while and practicing for 40 years. What do you think is driving that, the rise of compassion in some corporations?
That's a great question. I think corporate leaders have increasingly been thinking about a sense of purpose because I think with this overemphasis on profits, and they do feel that they're missing a trick. So it's not about the money, it's not about the turnover, but they feel that they can motivate their team member, they can motivate their staff, they can motivate the shareholders if they're able to show a greater sense of commitment to the purpose. The purpose could be a social purpose, improving the lives of people. It could be an environmental purpose, saving our planet, or it could be a combination of all of those. But I've also heard of companies look for more or being keen on more democratic processes, open voices, and some of them even using the human rights language in some of the literature and some of the communications. So I think people want to connect what they do, the mission of the business, to a broader purpose of doing good for people and the planet.
That makes sense to me. I hope that's true broadly for corporations. But I agree with what you said about purpose, I think. Perhaps also in a world that's increasingly volatile and complex, people are looking beyond traditional life purposes and rewards, and also with threats that really threaten our existence, like climate change. People are looking for higher purposes everywhere, at work, at home.
It does, and I think people are also more conscious of the interdependencies. So a problem is always a problem, even if it is not at your shores, even if it's happening 1,000 miles away. And we see with all these conflicts, whether it's in the Middle East or Ukraine or whether it's parts of Africa, we see the interdependencies of communities and societies. Which is why I also think that your point of globalization is absolutely true. It's much more interconnected. People feel a lot more informed and connected with what's happening in different parts of the world. It troubles them. It also sometimes makes them feel very helpless. What do I do about what's happening in Ukraine or Gaza or in Sudan? And I suppose the same in the not-for-profit sector. I think we are very privileged because we can do something. We can take part in a campaign. We can advocate and influence the policies of our governments to do something. We can raise funds. We can do a number of things, and you can feel connected. I think businesses feel possibly less so, and therefore they're really keen to see that their company and the shareholders, it's not just the profits, but it's a bit more than that, and it's looking at how do you actually contribute to a world that's a much better place to live in.
I think as nonprofit work has progressed, nonprofit leaders and for profit leaders alike see the value of whether all the outcomes are beneficial or not of partnerships and working together, right? And that's a good intersection where compassion can rub
Indeed.
off.
Indeed.
One of the things that I encounter when talking with nonprofit leaders is the long arc of change, and also the scale of issues can be daunting. And so, how have you stayed motivated all of these years? I'm assuming you enjoy the work too. I certainly do, and that was a discovery I made, that I loved the work. I loved the complexity of it, and I loved the way it shifted my perspective. And clearly, it makes you feel good because you're benefiting other human beings. How have you stayed motivated, and do you like the work?
So first things first, I absolutely
Yeah,
love the work. I couldn't think of
yeah.
doing any other work. And what keeps me motivated is when I see these massive stories of change, these very transformational changes that you see from ordinary people in communities that have so little, and yet they demonstrate so much resilience, so much solidarity, so much agency. And that's what makes you believe that in some way you're working with them instead of for them, and in
Hmm.
some way they're changing the world around them in their communities. So whether it's the men in Bangladesh who have led on climate proofing their communities in terms of anticipating what to do when a flood comes in rather than worrying about
Hmm.
it when it's completely flooded with water, so
Right.
things of the leadership that they demonstrate, or in Nigeria, where you see women stand up against violence. And I saw that in Ghana as well, where school girls are standing up against violence against girls in schools because they want girls to have a safe space for them to study, learn, and flourish. And when you see all these different examples, and every single time I've visited any of the countries that we worked in, and I think by now I would have visited about 30 different countries across Asia, Africa, and Central America, you do find this really, really passionate leaders at the community level who are doing everything that they can to make their communities that much stronger, more resilient, but also
Hmm.
holding their local governments to account for better
Yeah.
education, for better health, for better infrastructure, for their own rights. And when you see that happen, you sense you sense the privilege that you enjoy in the world that you
Hmm.
live in, but equally you feel that yes, that is something worth fighting for and fighting with, and seeing the contribution you can make in supporting that struggle, in supporting that campaign that they have at the local level. And
Yeah.
that has never failed me, which is why every time you go out there, that's my motivation trigger.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you enjoy going to the field?
Totally. I mean, that's, I think, the most satisfying part of my life in this career, where you travel to, you're not a tourist, so you go to all these different countries and you go to really very remote areas. You gain access to people's lives through their homes, their communities, because invariably, irrespective of which part of the world you travel in, people tend to be very open, very welcoming, which is so different
Hmm.
from the kind of communities we live in, because we tend to be very closed. Out there, they're
Right.
willing to share a meal, they're willing to host you, they're willing to talk to you about the stories of life, some of the challenges that they've had, but also how they've overcome their challenge. And it's very hard not to be moved by the stories. And of course, it's very hard not to feel even more motivated and saying, yeah, I think I'm doing the right thing, I'm going to continue.
When I started at Mercy Corps, the CEO immediately sent me to Ethiopia before I'd even really spent any time with my staff. And that was a very wise move because that connection is so powerful. And I love what you said about the non patriarchal nature of good development work. And that was something I learned to take the opportunity to learn and to partner, not to be in charge, not to direct, but to ask questions. And it was very helpful.
I mean, they know best. They know best about what they need to change. And all they are asking you is just be with us, stand with us, and of course, support us where you can. But we know what to do. We know what the solutions are. Just to help us amplify our voice, just give us that little push, that little support, and we can do it ourselves. And I think that's where the whole discourse has also changed, where we talk about local development, localization, and the
Hmm.
leadership invested in changing lives of their own community rather than solutions that are imported from other parts of the world.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that occurred to me as you were talking about that was that the inside of a nonprofit, you can model that behavior inside of the organization, different groups working together, and really partner and not just lob requests over the wall to each other, not act like a service organization inside the larger organization, but really partner with all of your teammates. And that is a kind of model inside of a nonprofit with your colleagues for also working with beneficiaries.
Absolutely. I think one of the things that I have been told in the past, and something that I've imbibed from the leaders I work with, is that it's all about collaboration and not competition. So it's not
Hmm.
about which team or which function or which department is more important. We need to pull our weight together, because ultimately it's the mission and the objectives of the organization that's more important than anything else. And I think that's something hard for people who tend to think in terms of silos. They tend to think in
Hmm.
terms of, so whether it's fundraising or communications or program delivery or policy or IT or finance, of who has got the upper hand. As leaders and leadership teams, it's a constant challenge for us to nurture that spirit of collaboration, so that we get the best out of people and we keep the
Hmm.
organizational mission always in focus over everything else.
How do you cultivate that in the organizations that you've worked in? Because we know from recent and not so recent studies that human beings are fundamentally tribal, and it's natural when you start working at a company for your team to be the most important thing. So, how do you keep teams on track and being efficient, and at the same time ensure that you're getting cooperation and collaboration and not competition and not siloing?
So I have this favorite story that I heard in my childhood, that different
Mm-hmm.
parts of the body had a fight with each other as to who was more important. Was it the eye? Was it the nose? Was it the ears? Was it the arms? Was it the legs? And they all fought with each other because each one had a viewpoint. That the eye said, obviously, if you don't see, you know where you're heading to, right? The ears
Mm-hmm.
said that if you don't listen, then you don't gain knowledge, that you need me to carry things. The legs said you need me to keep walking. One part of the body was absolutely quiet and said, okay, I'll just keep quiet and not function. Let them sort it out. And that was the stomach. It refused to digest the food. And then all parts of the body were weak and tired. So this was like a fun story, basically to say that just because somebody is quiet, it doesn't mean that they're not important. Everybody has a role to contribute. And I've constantly come across this with finance teams. The finance teams always feel that they are seen as back operations. They're not visible. The program and the policy team are the more glamorous teams. They're delivering programs or they're influencing government policies. They're out in conferences. They're seeing the change at the community level. So that's great. Even fundraising and communications have got a very tangible role because it's about money. You raise funds, you need money to run your programs. The finance people, they're chipping away, chipping away, chipping away, and IT as well, they're chipping away, chipping away. So they provide the ecosystem that can develop the credibility of the organization, establish the credibility of the organization. So I've always found that the finance people find a little less connected, because they don't see how they connect with the mission of the organization. So what I've tried to do, sometimes successfully, sometimes not so successfully, is try to work with each of these different teams and try to sort of trace the contribution they make to the mission of the organization, but also the contribution that others make to the mission of the organization. So how do you, for instance, talk to the program and the policy teams on why fundraising and finance are really equally important? Because if the fundraisers don't raise the money, we don't deliver the programs, nor can you influence policies. Likewise, if the finance people they don't manage to get you clean audits, it has a huge detrimental impact on the reputation of the organization, which means you don't raise funds, which means you don't deliver programs, which means you don't get to your conferences in New York or wherever, right? So it's constantly challenging, but also supporting people to realize that there is an element of contribution of every single team. That's why they're in the team. The other thing I've tried in different settings is to rotate the leadership of the organization. So, for example, in currently we have an executive team. The executive team meets every 2 weeks, but we have a rotational chair. So different directors chair the executive team for about 3 months so that they also get a chance at looking across the organization. But again, it's not privileging one over the other. It's purely by rotation. So everybody gets a chance to try to shape the agenda of the executive team and also bring them out of their normal function so that they step into an organizational shoes and look at things across the organization. And these things work really well because people at the end of the day, they really want to be better. They have got this intrinsic drive to be better, to push the boundaries, to do something that's unusual and different. And given the opportunity, they would do it. And that makes my job easier because it's about nurturing. And then I step back, and my job is more of, as a CEO, to nurture these different talents and to identify who can do things better rather than me always being in the driving seat and expecting to have all the answers.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that nurturing role in the United States in football, not soccer, we would call it running interference, you know. And you know, that's a very important role. I love what you said about great communication in the organization and making sure that everyone is acknowledged for their role and making very clear the connections, because what may not be obvious to the program teams is just how connected they are to the finance team or the IT team. And being a CIO, CTO in big nonprofits, I very much understand how IT or finance can become a second-class citizen. But I think if you insist on partnerships and insist on good communication, and as I described earlier, not lobbing a service request over the wall to IT, and then they create an answer, they create a technology, and then they lob it back, there's no room for real learning in that scenario. If the technology folks aren't included in program conversations, they can't formulate the best technology. And if the program folks aren't included in some of the technology situations, they can't understand what technologies might be brought to bear for a particular program or a particular context. Very important. And that communication thing is, my discovery was more and more over my years as a leader, both in the private sector and nonprofit sector, how important communication was. Just can't overemphasize it. Yeah.
There was a beautiful proverb I heard when I was in Burkina Faso. It said that if you want to walk fast, you walk alone. If you want far, you walk together. So it's again the whole idea of working together to achieve, to walk farther, rather than just being fast and being the first one to reach a certain milestone.
Yeah. The other thing you said, and it's embedded in what you said, I think, is the idea of helping the whole organization see things clearly. Often, if people see things clearly, everyone sees things clearly, and there's good alignment, the solution's right there. You don't have to work hard to find a solution if you see everything clearly. But that's hard in a big organization.
And you're right, communications is everything, and that requires time. It doesn't just happen overnight. It's about bringing people together. Also trying to understand, you asked a question of motivation earlier, but it's exactly that. It's trying to understand what would motivate people and encourage them to step up. But what is it that is holding them back? What are those barriers? And how can we, the rest of us, help that person overcome the barriers? Because equally, that person could help somebody else overcome their barriers. So it's again this notion of contribution as well, that everybody has a role, everybody has a contribution to make to the overall mission and purpose of the organization.
Yeah, the mention of barriers is a good segue. What are the most difficult barriers that you've faced in your time as a nonprofit leader? And you can generalize or you can cite specific examples.
So the first barrier is it's very hard to sort of prove what you have done as an organization, because the process of long-term development is quite messy. It's not linear. It's very much unlike a factory production where if your engineering design is right, if you've got your materials right, if you've got the right skill sets, you roll out a beautiful car or a beautiful piece of machinery out. That's not how things are. There are lots of uncertainties, a lot of ambiguities that you're dealing with, because ultimately it's about people's lives. It's not just delivering an education program or a health program, but it's about transforming lives. And it can be quite a challenge to prove to your board that you're in the right direction. It's quite a challenge proving to your donors that you're on the right journey, because again, there are donors who are keen to see results in a short time frame of a year or 2 years or 3 years. I mean, 3 years is being a bit too generous, but I've been in situations where people have been wanting to see massive changes in just a year or two. That's very hard. I think that's one of the biggest barriers where there is a classic clash of cultures between what a nonprofit is expected to do and does
Mm-hmm.
well, and
Mm-hmm.
others who don't necessarily understand or have not had that experience of going through it. I'm not generalizing all donors. In fact, there are some absolutely fantastic organizations who have had great people who have had that experience, who have seen it, who have done that themselves. And when they
Mm-hmm.
go to a foundation or a philanthropic organization, they take that learning out there. But at the same time, there are other organizations who don't have the benefit of that experience, and then everything is tracked to that one prism of what are the milestones you've achieved, and if you're not achieved, then that's a failure, which then means that
Mm-hmm.
people find it very hard to talk about failures. They want to just talk about their successes, but then the
Mm-hmm.
organization loses out on some really amazing learning, because some of the best things that you learn are also from your failures. So
Mm-hmm.
I think those are some of the barriers that you face in terms of the messiness of a long-term development or a transformation program, and being able to convey that story in a very credible manner, in a very convincing manner to your board, to donors, but also to the general public or to the governments you're responsible for.
Yeah, that's a beautiful answer. The other thing that accompanies that frequently is sweeping real costs under the rug.
It's all about, again, the competitions thing, isn't it? Because many, largely the official aid agencies, they would, they would have this call for proposals, and then sometimes my worry always is that it's a race to the bottom, because everybody is trying
Yeah.
to shave off costs, everybody's trying to show that they're super efficient. But in being super efficient, at least on paper, they are seriously undermining some core concerns of partnerships, of sustainability, of
Mm-hmm.
investing in learning, investing in capacities of people, because you're just delivering, let's say, a sanitation program of constructing X number of toilets. And then
Mm-hmm.
what happens? You go there after 2 years or 3 years, most of the toilets are not used or they've collapsed, because you did engage in that race to the bottom, and you did
Mm-hmm.
engage in something that shouldn't have been done at all. There was no community consultation. You didn't invest time in that, because all these things take money. All these things cost
Mm-hmm.
money and time.
Yeah.
And donors
Yeah.
sometimes don't have the patience or the bandwidth to factor these things in. And it then just becomes a fairly commercial operation.
You've heard of the unholy trinity of product development or productivity. You can work good, you can work fast, you can work cheap. Pick two.
Definitely the good.
Well, no, no. What I'm saying is it's hard to do all three at the same time.
Exactly. Exactly.
So that the phrase is good, fast, cheap.
Yeah.
Pick two. That is a ubiquitous problem with nonprofits. That messiness is almost embedded into every nonprofit situation. What have you found are the best ways to mitigate that?
I'll go back to your point on communications that you said, Chip, a little earlier, to be held accountable for not engaging and investing time in those communications. We also tend to have a very transactional relationship with the donors. It's like, okay, so here is a proposal, here is our money, thank you very much, here is our report, thank you very much. That kind of a relationship. Where things have worked well is where we have built that relationship of trust, and that again requires time. It's a relationship of trust. It's about asking for ideas and solutions as well. So it's not just we giving you a proposal and you approving, because if you're a donor, you would have done 50 such projects in the past. What have you learned from those projects that we can benefit from? So how do you build that co-creation approach? You mentioned this point about visiting Ethiopia very early on in your tenure at Mercy Corps. We tend to do that with our donors as well, encouraging them to come and actually see what's happening, because always seeing is believing. There's only this much you can convince through the best written proposals, but the moment people come out, talk to the stakeholders, talk to the communities, talk to the local government, they realize that the messiness is real, and we are there in context doing that work because of the messiness. If it was a very clear system, a systematic way of working, as you find in many of the Western countries, where there are systems and institutions and processes and everything in place, even then, of course, there are lots of deficiencies, as we know. But still, that's not where some of the communities are, where we are, where we work in. So it's about getting real, especially with donors who have not had the benefit of that experience in the past. But so, yes, how much time do we build in those relationships? How much time do we spend on us? Let me rephrase that. How much courage do we demonstrate in talking to them about risks and failures without worrying about whether the money is going to go or not? And that is a really important conversation. So I haven't found any silver bullets to that, to be honest, because ultimately it has to be a two-way street. We need to be open about the challenges, the barriers, the failures, but also the learnings and what has been achieved and where the successes are. Donors need to be interested in that, because there are many donors who are very happy to receive it, ask you a few questions, and then file your report in. Many donors would actually love a conversation if we are willing to give the time. And so, yes, it becomes a two-way street. So where those two-way relationships are strong, where it's built on the trust, you do find that you can move mountains. There are organizations that have been receiving support from donors for up to 20 years, because they know that it takes time to bring about the change. And they also know sometimes that there is always a backlash when a change happens at the community level, because some vested interests are not happy. So things actually roll back. But then that means that something is changing. That's why there's a pushback, there's a challenge, there's a rollback. But equally, the optimism that you can push things forward because you've got the experience behind you. But those things, those messiness needs to be built into your regular conversations. Continue to build trust, ask for solutions, co-create.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's an overused and perhaps overloaded term these days, but transparency is so important with donors and board members. I think we underestimate frequently how they will receive news. And so if you can be realistic about all the problems you're facing and not hesitate to describe those in detail, describe the solution, be transparent when things fail, describe the corrective action, describe the learnings, that brings donors and board members along. I don't think they bristle at that as much. And of course, there are always pockets of incompetence in any global operation. There are things that go wrong and perhaps things that shouldn't have gone wrong. But I think trusting your board members and trusting your donors to really understand things is key, because if you're always painting this beautiful picture, you're naturally setting their expectations too high. You're naturally setting yourself up for a backlash.
Absolutely. I think you're spot on, Chip. I've had so many experiences where, especially when it comes to financial mismanagement, where we spot a problem and we have immediately communicated the donors, often in 24 hours if we can, if not 24, if we need more information in 48 hours, but not later than 48 hours, where it's about saying, hey, there's a problem with the project that you're funding. We found that somebody has been misusing the money. But the good news is that it has been tracked through our internal systems. So we know that our internal systems are working. We know that there is a problem here. This is the process of investigation, and we'll keep you involved. We'll keep you informed, in terms of what the problem was, what is the damage, what are we doing about it, and the corrective measures taken. And 9 times out of 10, the donors have just, thank you for letting us know. Let us know when the process is done. There might be one incident or 1 in 10 cases where the donor might say that, okay, fine, that's not great news. So either they pressurize you for more information, or in the worst case scenario, they would say, sorry, I think we should stop funding. But that's really rare. That's really rare.
Yeah.
And you're absolutely right. Transparency builds trust.
What would you offer up to other nonprofit leaders as 3 pearls of wisdom that you've come to realize over your vast experience as a nonprofit leader?
I think the first thing is, in our world, it's really important to have the resilience. The challenges are getting more complex, and many people have talked about the triple of COVID, climate change, and conflict. And it's difficult to find the answers to that, especially at a time when aid flows are reducing and the challenges are increasing. It does require leaders to demonstrate the resilience, be calm under pressure, be comfortable with the fact that you may not have all the answers, but working alongside communities, partners, other stakeholders, you can get onto the other side with really good solutions. So you need to just hang in there. and constantly strive to do the best that you can under the circumstances. So resilience is the first one. The second one is always invest in your people. I hate to use the word asset, but if I say that they are your most
Totally.
precious resource that you have, invariably people step up when there are challenges in ways that are sometimes, you wouldn't have thought about it as a leader. So how do you invest in your people? How do you create the culture that is right for the organization? Because there isn't that one indicator that drives everything, i.e., profits. You're constantly struggling to find out what are the right metrics against which I measure my effectiveness as a leader or as an organization. And one of the best things that you can really invest your time and energy and effort and money is in your people, giving them the right opportunities, giving them the voice, the sense of agency. So never cut corners on that unless you've got a severe financial challenge that you can, but it still doesn't mean that you cannot respect your people. That doesn't cost money. Respect your people irrespective of who they are, what they do, and where they're located. And the third thing I would say is it's linked to this people concept, but always build strong relationships with the board. Many times I found that organizations collapse because it's the executive that's driving it and they aren't really engaging with the board. And again, that becomes a very transactional relationship where you're keeping things away from the board rather than calling in the board to not just communicate with them but also seeking the support where you really need the support. The role of boards in non-profits is really very important, and I think it's kind of under recognized. It's seen as a regulatory requirement or compliance rather than the board having the wisdom and the maturity to steer the organization, help you with its strategic and operational delivery.
Perfect. So cultivate resilience, invest in your people, and team with the board.
Indeed. You said it much better than I did, Chip.
No, not at all. I just summarized. The other thing that emerges from what you just said is cultivate some humility too. The board is there to help you. And no one expects one person to have all the answers or to come up with all the insights or be able to analyze all the problems. That's what they're there for. And if we're not leveraging them, then we're worse off.
Indeed, because they also are seeking.
Yeah.
This is this organization's mission. That's why, because they're all volunteers. They're not being paid. They're volunteering their time because they believe in the cause, and that's why they are on the board of a non-profit. So it's leveraging that wisdom, and it's a way of valuing the board and the knowledge that they bring in.
Yeah. Thank you, Girish. It's been a pure pleasure talking with you, and we'll talk after the podcast a little bit about how people can plug into what you're doing now.
Thank you. Pleasure talking to you as well.
Oh, good. The insightful answers were more important.
Thank you so much.
Okay, more soon, I hope. Okay,
Indeed.
take care.
Take care. You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.